When I turned down the old dirt road toward my family's land for the first time in 6 years, I expected tall grass, a weathered cabin, maybe even the rotted remains of Grandpa's barn. What I didn't expect was a mansion 3 stories, tall with white columns, bronze lanterns, and a circular driveway paved in polished stone. For a moment, I sat in my truck, engine idling, trying to reconcile the memory of what should have been with the monstrosity in front of me. My name's Lucas Riley, and this 50-acre property, nestled just outside of Coyote Hollow, has belonged to the Riley family for nearly 90 years. We never sold an inch. I stepped out, boots crunching the gravel that used to lead to our barn where hay once lay scattered. A BMW now gleamed under the sun. Then I saw the sign, Whispering Pines, HOA, private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. HOA. I blinked hard. This land sat miles from the nearest subdivision. There were no curbs, no sidewalks, no street lamps. It was wild land oak trees, deer trails, and the same old creek I learned to fish in. Young security guard in a navy polo came out of a booth that hadn't been there a decade ago. Can I help you, sir? Yeah, I said. This is my land. He raised an eyebrow. I think you've got the wrong address. I do, I replied flatly. Then I suggest you talk to the HOA president. Ms. Blackwell handles all property issues. The name hit me like a slap. Cheryl Blackwell. I knew of her. Local real estate baron, socialite, and self-declared community visionary. The kind who wore pearls to city council meetings and saw rural land as undeveloped potential. Apparently, that potential now came with imported Italian tiles and $40,000 chandeliers. I was escorted past a line of ornamental trees freshly planted and perfectly spaced toward a mansion that looked more like a luxury hotel than a home. A butler opened the door, and there she was, Cheryl, late 40s, immaculately dressed, and wearing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She gave me a once-over, lingering disapprovingly on my dusty boots and sun-creased face. Can I help you? She asked, voice smooth as lacquer. This property belongs to the Riley family, I said. You're standing on my land. She gave a soft, condescending laugh. Oh, you must be Lucas, the missing heir, right? I heard you were working abroad, engineering, oil fields, I said. Well, she said, gesturing to a table stacked with documents, it appears your grandfather defaulted on the Eastern Tract's property taxes. The county auctioned the land 2 years ago. My holding company acquired it through a third party. Everything's been legally filed. I picked up one of the deeds. The signature claiming to be my grandfather's looked off too clean, too recent. My grandfather was half blind by the time he passed. There was never any notice, I said. No warning, no mail. My family's taxes were always prepaid through the trust. She shrugged. I'm not responsible for what the county did or didn't do, but I am responsible for developing this community. And quite frankly, I won't let misplaced nostalgia stand in the way of progress. She motioned toward the window, where rows of new homes were being framed in the distance. We're revitalizing this entire stretch. Whispering Pines will be a jewel of Coyote Hollow, and your old shack wasn't exactly a cultural landmark. You demolished it, I said sharply. She didn't blink. We had a demolition permit. The structure was unsafe. A chill rooted itself in my spine. This wasn't just theft, it was erasure. You built your mansion on a lie, I said quietly. Lucas, she replied, tilting her head as if addressing a child. You can scream fraud all you want, but I have attorneys, blueprints, permits, and city officials on my side. And let's be honest, you're a man with a cabin and a last name. I'm building an empire. I clenched my jaw and handed the deed back. Enjoy it while you can. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Is that a threat? No, I said, turning toward the door. It's a warning. As I stepped outside, past manicured hedges and a fountain that had replaced the grove where my grandmother once grew herbs, I felt something tighten in my chest, not just anger but purpose. She thought she'd buried my claim under paperwork and luxury, but Cheryl Blackwell had no idea that her mansion, her pride, and joy stood atop a legal trap my grandfather built decades ago. She'd paved over it with arrogance and steel, but the foundation was still mine, and I wasn't going anywhere. After my first encounter with Cheryl Blackwell, I could have stormed into court or chained myself to a bulldozer, but that's not how you win against someone like her. Cheryl didn't fight in the open. She operated in shadows: contracts, zoning, boards, backroom favors, and if I was going to beat her, I needed to learn her kingdom inside and out. So I stayed quiet and observed. Whispering Pines had ballooned into a sprawling enclave of modern countryside living. Each home looked ripped from a luxury catalog: stone exteriors, solar shingles, landscape lighting programmed by app. But beneath the polished veneer was a rigid regime. It started with mailboxes. Each one had to be an exact shade of forest green, down to the brand of paint. 1 inch too short, and a fine appeared too tall. Same result. A retired named Mrs. Hargrove had racked up $300 in violations because she hung a ceramic bird feeder that distracted from uniformity. Then came the curfews. Lawn maintenance hours were restricted to specific days. Children weren't allowed to play basketball after 6 p.m. One father was cited because his teenage son played acoustic guitar on the porch. Cheryl deemed it a disturbance. She ruled the HOA board like a monarch, her decisions cloaked as committee votes but always steered by her iron will. People whispered her name like a curse, but no one stood up to her, not openly. Too many feared the liens, the threats, the legal traps she laid without blinking. I learned she had built a network of loyalists, real estate agents, surveyors, a city planner or two, people she could call with a wink and a promise. Every inch of Whispering Pines bowed to her influence. And yet, there were cracks. I found them in the conversations whispered over back fences, in the neighbors who lowered their voices when her name came up. I started knocking on doors, introducing myself not as the guy trying to reclaim his land but as someone who knew exactly what Cheryl was. "Remember when your family ran cattle through this valley?" said George Braxton, a Vietnam vet living on the outer ring. "Now they find me for hanging the flag at the wrong angle." Another neighbor, a single mother named Dana, confessed that Cheryl had threatened to tow her car for a barely expired inspection sticker, then backed off when Dana offered to volunteer for the HOA's landscaping committee. Bit by bit, I collected stories, I took notes, I compared signatures, maps, documents. My grandfather had left behind more than memories he'd kept, meticulous records in a rusted filing cabinet beneath the floorboards of our old cabin, which Cheryl had bulldozed. Fortunately, I'd retrieved everything before leaving for overseas. What Cheryl didn't realize was that, despite her slick paperwork and fraudulent deed, she'd missed something crucial. My family had never finalized the sale of the Eastern Tract because the land was part of a protective conservation easement, one that restricted commercial development. The paperwork had been buried in legalese, and most people would have overlooked it. But I wasn't most people. I was trained to read technical specs, contracts, and regulatory guidelines in oil fields where one wrong signature could shut down a $50 million operation. I saw the flaw and I knew how to use it. Still, I needed time and leverage, so I let Cheryl believe she'd won. I nodded politely when we crossed paths. I pretended to be overwhelmed and underinformed. Meanwhile, I made quiet visits to the county clerk's office, pulled old survey maps, photographed every inch of her mansion's footprint. Then, just as I began preparing the legal side, Cheryl made her boldest move yet. She filed a request to expand the HOA's jurisdiction, not just to include her mansion, but to formally annex my entire remaining property, the remaining 15 acres where my grandfather's cabin once stood. Her plan was to turn it into a presidential green park with her name carved in marble. That was the final straw. She hadn't just taken what wasn't hers. She was planning to turn my family's history into a monument to herself, but she didn't know the documents I had. She didn't know the conservation law she'd already violated, and she certainly didn't know that by annexing the full tract, she had tied her mansion legally to land she could never own. I smiled that evening as I watched bulldozers clearing trees for Cheryl's grand park. She thought she was expanding her empire. She didn't realize she was building it atop a legal sinkhole, and I was ready to pull the ground out from under her. 3 weeks after Cheryl submitted her annexation request, I filed me a formal petition with the county land office to challenge the legitimacy of her deed and the construction permits tied to it. But I wasn't just filing paperwork. I was detonating a legal mine she'd been dancing over for months. My attorney, a sharp-witted property rights specialist named Evan Grant, laid it out clearly in the first injunction. Structure known as Lot 1 to ABIE. The residence of Cheryl Blackwell was constructed partially within a federally protected conservation easement and on land not legally transferred from the Riley Trusted Development, is subject to reversal, demolition, and federal fines. We submitted the documents on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the county clerk had called Cheryl in for an emergency review. She didn't take it well, according to Evan. She stormed into the office with 3 lawyers in tow and accused the clerk of corruption. She demanded to see the so-called evidence. When she realized the documentation included her own signatures and building schematics overlaid perfectly on my grandfather's survey lines, she went quiet. Dead quiet. By Monday, her legal team had already begun scrambling to file counterclaims, but they had nothing solid. Her entire defense relied on a chain of paperwork that crumbled under scrutiny. A third-party company had purchased land they never had the right to sell. Her mansion's foundation extended 23 feet into protected soil. Even worse for her, anyway, was the press. I didn't contact reporters, not directly, but word spreads fast when the queen of the HOA is accused of building a $4 million home on stolen land. A local journalist named Dana Whitmore called me for comment. I gave her the facts, quietly, respectfully. I let Cheryl keep digging her hole within. Days, the headline appeared on 3 regional sites. HOA president's mansion faces demolition after land dispute with local family. Cheryl fired back with a press conference on the steps of her marble-pillared porch. She called it a tragic misunderstanding and assured residents that her legal team was working diligently to resolve a clerical mix-up. But behind the scenes, panic set in. Homeowners, once obedient and silent, started showing up at HOA meetings with questions and tempers. If Cheryl's mansion was illegal, what did it mean for the rest of them? If she'd bullied her way through land laws, what other lies had she told? Then came the tipping point. One of her former board members, Mr. Callahan, a retired architect, stepped forward, he admitted Cheryl had pressured him into backdating a structural compliance letter. Another neighbor revealed that the annexation vote she'd pushed through had been falsified. Several yes votes came from names of people who no longer lived in the community. My attorney filed a second motion, fraudulent governance and an unlawful extension of HOA jurisdiction. Now the county wasn't just looking at Cheryl's mansion, they were auditing her entire HOA leadership. Every project, every fine, every ruling. By the end of the week, Cheryl's marble empire was cracking. I watched from a distance, never speaking at meetings, never confronting her directly. That would have given her a villain to rally against. But I wasn't interested in shouting matches. I was letting the law do what my grandfather had always believed in: protect what's rightfully yours, and let truth cut deeper than anger ever could. Evan called me late one evening with the words I'd been waiting to hear. She has 72 hours to vacate. A temporary injunction had been approved. Cheryl's mansion would be sealed for environmental review, pending demolition if restoration of the conservation easement proved impossible. Fines were already accruing $10,000 per day for encroachment. The HOA's assets were frozen, and Cheryl, she was nowhere to be found. When I drove by her mansion that night, the lights were off, the fountain had been shut down. A single red tag fluttered on the front gate, under legal review entry, prohibited. The empire she'd built on fraud and arrogance was collapsing. But this wasn't the end. There was still one piece left. Cheryl had tried to strip my family's land of its identity, pave it over, and rename it in her own image. But now, with the community turning against her and the law closing in, I had the chance to do something far more lasting, something she could never undo, and it started with a motion. I'd already filed with the county, one that would flip the power dynamic forever. I wasn't just taking back what was mine. I was turning her monument to power into a public reminder of justice. The final blow came not with sirens or headlines, but with a vote. 2 weeks after the injunction shut down Cheryl Blackwell's mansion, the HOA board, what was left of it, held a special emergency meeting, held in a neighbor's garage rather than Cheryl's once lavish clubhouse. The air buzzed with unease and resolve. I stood at the back, silent, arms folded, as the remaining board members read out the resolution. Motion to remove Cheryl Blackwell as president of Whispering Pines HOA due to proven misconduct, fraudulent annexation, and ongoing legal violations. The vote passed unanimously. When the gavel dropped, the room didn't erupt in cheers, it just exhaled. The kind of collective breath people hold when power has ruled through fear too long. Cheryl didn't show. Her mansion, now shuttered and silent, stood like a ghost over the land she tried to steal. Eviction notices were posted. Her assets tied up in litigation. And as for the marble sign outside her gate that once read President Cheryl Blackwell, someone had spray-painted over it in block letters. Empire of Ego closed for good. But I wasn't finished. I submitted a final proposal to the county to convert the disputed land, including the footprint of Cheryl's mansion, into a public conservation and heritage site, funded in part by a state grant and partially through damages awarded from her violations. I called it Riley Preserve, not because I needed my name on it, but because I needed something else. Memory, where Cheryl saw blank canvas for domination. I saw echoes of my grandfather planting pecan trees. I saw the barn I helped him repair at age 9. I saw my mother's garden, now gone beneath imported sod. And the fishing line I once tangled in the creek's reeds. Now, those things would be protected forever. And the community, the very people Cheryl had punished, silenced, and intimidated, came together. Volunteers cleared the grounds, planted new native trees, and helped rebuild the trail that once led to the old cabin steps. I installed a small plaque beside the clearing where her mansion once stood. It read, "This land was taken by arrogance and returned by truth. May it remain free." As the demolition crew arrived, I stood beside Evan, watching the excavator arm rise. It wasn't rage I felt, it wasn't triumph, it was closure. The marble crumbled first, columns crashing like toppled statues. Glass shattered next, followed by walls splitting like brittle shells. By the end of the day, the monument Cheryl built to herself was dust. The air cleared, and in its place stood something more powerful than any mansion: accountability. The county fined Cheryl nearly $1 million in environmental violations and legal restitution. Her real estate license was suspended pending investigation. Her annexation vote was declared null. Every property she'd absorbed restored to its previous legal boundaries. And me, I didn't need to reclaim her throne. I never wanted it. But when the board offered me a seat on the newly restructured HOA, I accepted, not to lead, but to protect. I drafted new bylaws focused on transparency, limited authority, and homeowner autonomy. Fines required unanimous board approval. No more private meetings. No more unchecked power. Neighbors who once whispered now walked tall again. Kids played basketball after 6. The flag flew freely on George Braxton's porch in that ceramic bird feeder. It hung right outside Mrs. Hargrove's window, swinging in the breeze. Cheryl never returned. Rumor had it she moved out of state, chasing another gated dream in a place where people hadn't heard her name. But here, her legacy remained not in control, but in caution. Because if there's one thing this land taught me, it's that the ground beneath us carries more than roots. It holds history, and anyone who thinks they can pave over that with lies and luxury, well, they haven't met O'Reilly.